welcome to World Talks. My name is Diana Skaya. U.S. President Donald Trump and Russian President Vladimir Putin are set to meet for ceasefire talks in Alaska on August 15. And now questions are looming over territorial concessions, European unity, and the risks of a frozen conflict. Meanwhile, Donald Trump's special envoy Steve Witkoff is under fire after German media reported that misunderstood Russian President Vladimir Putin during Ukraine ceasefire talks. Joining me now to unpack this all is Rostyslav Khotin, senior editor of the Ukrainian service at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. So glad to have you here with us on TVP World.
Hello.
Now, Rostyslav, let me ask you this. Now, first of all, there's so many conflicting reports. I myself don't know what to believe anymore. Is Zelenskyy going to have a seat at this negotiating table? Is he not going to be present? What can you tell us?
First of all, there will be a bilateral summit, American-Russian bilateral summit in Alaska on the 15th of August. There were some reports that President Zelenskyy might join later, but they are unconfirmed. There are no grounds to stress this, to emphasize this, that Zelenskyy will be present somehow in the trilateral format. Especially when President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he's against meeting Zelenskyy. He said recently, just a couple of days ago, that for meeting with Zelenskyy, he is not against in principle, but that such meetings should be prepared well before, should be well prepared, well in advance. So Russia is not interested in talking to Zelenskyy now. President Trump can talk to Zelenskyy bilaterally, so the channels of communication between Kyiv and Washington, between Zelenskyy administration and the White House are opened constantly. So there is no ground now to think that there will be a trilateral meeting, including Zelenskyy, so far, at this moment.
All right, let me ask you this. Now, the Trump-Putin meeting has, of course, the potential to hopefully or possibly bring the conflict to an end. But let me ask you this, at what cost? There's a lot of talk about the Ukraine having to make territorial concessions. What's your take on that?
There are reports, leaks, that Russia might be ready for some sort of compromise, which is unfavorable to Ukraine and to the European partners of Ukraine. There were reports, leaks, that Russia is demanding the full control of the Donetsk region, and because now there about more than around two-thirds of Donetsk region is under Russian control, and they demand the full control of Donetsk region. And they are in control of 98% of Luhansk, neighboring Luhansk region. So Russia, technically, in theory, demands, according to reports, the full control of the Donbas region of Ukraine. Donetsk region plus Luhansk region. That's one thing. This is unacceptable for Ukraine. Why Ukraine should leave hundreds of thousands of its citizens in the Donetsk region under control of Kyiv government to give them to Russia? Second thing, which is unfavorable for Ukraine in this kind of territorial concession, that there is a strong defensive line that Ukraine builds in the Donbas, and if, in theory, you can imagine that Ukrainian armed forces are leaving Donetsk region, then it will expose the neighboring Dnipropetrovsk region for further Russian attacks, for further Russian advance. It will expose the second Ukrainian city of Kharkiv and Kharkiv region for further Russian attacks, so further Russian advances. So it's absolutely unacceptable for Ukraine.
So
then there is also contradiction.
So you're saying that you believe Russia won't stop there regardless of a ceasefire. This is my understanding from what you just mentioned.
That's what President Zelenskyy says. He says that if we are to agree for this unfavorable territorial concession, then it won't stop Russia. Russia will, after Crimea, he reminded Crimean example. Russia took Crimea, annexed Crimea, occupied Crimea, then it invaded Donbas with its proxies in the eastern Ukraine, the separatist forces created by Russia. And then it didn't stop full-fledged invasion of Ukraine. So if you give Russia concession here, unfavorable for Ukraine, then Russia won't stop and will try to move even further to occupy even bigger parts of Ukraine. Also, there is a thing about, I want to add one important thing about southern Ukraine. there are contradictory reports about southern Ukraine. What actually Putin told Steve Witkoff in Moscow on the 6th of August about Kherson and Zaporizhia regions. Because there are different readings of this meeting, of this Putin stance about southern Ukraine. One said that he was ready to stop where Russian forces are now located, kind of ceasefire, immediate ceasefire in the Kherson and Zaporizhia region in southern Ukraine, where the front line, freezing of the current front line. Other reports said that he insisted, he even offered withdrawal from Zaporizhia and Kherson region. We don't know that. We know that Steve Witkoff probably didn't understand correctly what Putin meant by in southern Ukraine. That's why these contradictions and contradictory reports about Putin's stance on southern Ukraine.
Do you think that Vitkov was deceived by the Russians?
We know that, according to even some American media, Steve Witkoff is not professional diplomat. Steve Witkoff is not professional military man like General Kellogg. He's not into this geopolitical business. He was a businessman, a property developer in New York, very much like Trump in his past, the property developer. Steve Witkoff doesn't speak Russian. Steve Vitkov doesn't know Russia well. Steve Vitkov doesn't know the KGB systems that Putin has created over the quarter of a century in Russia, the regime run by former representatives of KGB, of special forces, special services. So Steve Vitkov is not in the capacity of being he even cannot convey the proper message from Putin to Trump. You know, he didn't understand this mishmash about southern Ukraine. So there are a lot of questions about Steve Witkoff's role and capabilities, whether he's capable of being a special envoy in Russia on such an important country, is such an important time of war between Russia and Ukraine.
Do you think his lack of diplomatic experience can actually damage these high-stake talks?
I can quote only American press, even American journalists. They question the abilities of Steve Witkoff of being a special envoy on Russia. You know, like, as I said, he is not an expert on that region. He's not a diplomat. He's not a former military man. It's a difficult time of war. It's not just an ordinary type of situation, diplomatic confusion or diplomatic row, and he's sent as a special envoy, peacemaker. No, it's a time of war. People are dying. Weeks after weeks are passing, months after months are passing. Already 3.5 years of this full-fledged aggression of Russia against Ukraine is on.
Let me cut you off and ask you this. But do you think that the freezing of the conflict, because I mean, this is what you've been mentioning for quite a while now, if the conflict were to be frozen along the current lines, would this serve more Russian interests or American interests?
It will serve both, and Ukraine. Ukraine is also insisting on the freezing current line of contact, current front line, but not as a final point, as Putin thinks of it, but as a starting point. Let's freeze the military activities, let's freeze the combat action on the current front line, let's freeze it, and then let's start serious diplomatic work on a peace deal, on a peace agreement, peace treaty afterwards. And Putin wants to freeze it and de facto claiming these territories as Russian territories. That's not acceptable for Ukraine, that's not acceptable for Europeans, and I think and for Americans as well, because freezing of the current front line, freezing of the current line of contact is a starting point for more serious diplomatic work about peace treaty in the future to achieve the lasting and stable peace, to prevent further Russian aggressions against Ukraine, but not as a final point as Kremlin sees it. Like, let's freeze it and that's it. That's the contradiction between stances in Moscow, Washington, and Kyiv.
Right, Rostyslav, on Saturday, leaders of several EU countries, as well as EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen, they issued a joint statement, of course, supporting Ukraine and saying that they should have a seat at the table, that there should be lasting peace in Ukraine, and that it requires Kiev's seat at the table and involvement. What can you tell me about that? How is is Europe going to be able to have a seat at the table, and what can Europe do?
First of all, Ukraine insists very much that Europeans should be present at any serious peace talks, any table concerning the war in Ukraine. Europeans also think that the current war in Ukraine is not about Ukraine only. It's also a European war. It's a war about the future of security, of European security. So Europeans should be present. I think Americans also now changed their mind over the last couple of months, couple of even weeks, that they now think that European involvement is important. That's why Vitkov held talks, briefed European security advisors on his talks with Putin. That's why Trump holds constant phone calls with European leaders. So there is now consensus that Europe should not be ignored, that the peace deal and ceasefire should not be imposed on Ukraine by Russia and America, that Americans value now European involvement, especially when Europeans are very proactive. They adopted 18 packages of sanctions against Russia. Europeans are now buying American weapons for Ukraine. So European voice is important, especially when NATO membership, although it's mentioned by Europeans as a potential security guarantee for Ukraine, but nevertheless we understand that NATO membership is not realistic now in immediate future. That's why for Ukraine, the only realistic option to be a member of the Western Club is to be a member of the European Union. That's why Brussels is also important. That Brussels is present there in the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and other European leaders.
Thank you so much, Rostyslav Khotin, Ukrainian senior editor of the Ukrainian service of Radio Free Liberty, Radio Europe, for being with us here on World Talks.
Thank you.
And that's all for this edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm Diana Skaya. Thanks for watching.